What would happen if two of the poorest countries in South America, nations where most people were still struggling for food and clothing, decided to throw an entire generation of young men into a land so harsh that even nature itself seemed unwilling to allow human existence there? Not for honor, not for religion, nor for centuries-old ethnic hatred, but for one thing alone, a rumor that there might be oil. That is the story of the Chaco War, one of the bloodiest, most absurd, and least remembered conflicts of the 20th century. A war in which more than 100,000 people died, not in grand battles, but mainly from thirst, disease, exhaustion, and blind faith in a future that never existed. Gran Chaco, the land where it all began, was not a place that inspired dreams. It was a vast territory stretching between Paraguay and Bolivia. Scorching heat, thorny scrubland, malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and cracked dry soil where water was almost a luxury. For centuries, Gran Chaco was largely forgotten. No one fought over it. No one truly wanted it. For most South Americans at the time, Chaco was merely a blank space on the map, a desolate buffer zone with no value, no future. But everything changed in the early 20th century. Vague, unverified geological reports began to appear. Whispers spread among political and military circles, there might be oil in Chaco. No one was certain. There was no clear evidence. Yet as the world entered the age of oil, those two words "might be" were enough to ignite the ambitions of both nations. For Bolivia, Chaco was a matter of survival. After losing its access to the sea to Chile in an earlier war, Bolivia became landlocked, strangled in trade and transportation. For them, controlling Gran Chaco meant access to the Paraguay River, the only route out of geographic isolation. Chaco was not just territory. It was the hope of national resurrection. For Paraguay, a smaller and poorer country that had already suffered devastating losses in previous wars, Chaco was a symbol of honor and history. They believed the land had long belonged to them. That abandoning it would be no different from admitting yet another defeat. Both nations were poor. Both societies were fragile. And neither was willing to lose anything more. By the late 1920s, tensions began to escalate. There was no formal declaration of war. No grand speeches delivered to the public. Only small forts rising in the Chaco forest, crude outposts hastily built amid heat and mosquitoes. Scattered clashes occurred. A patrol disappeared. A guard post was attacked. Deaths for which no one claimed responsibility. Yet everyone understood that the road to full-scale war was growing shorter by the day. In June 1932, the final boundary was crossed. A fort was seized. A group of soldiers was shot dead. And from that moment on, there was no turning back. War officially erupted. On paper, Bolivia had every advantage. A larger population. More modern equipment. An army trained along European lines, supported by foreign military advisors. Many believed it would be a short war, one in which Bolivia would dominate and quickly secure victory. Paraguay was the opposite. A small army. A limited budget. Severely inadequate equipment. But they possessed something Bolivia did not: familiarity with the terrain and the ability to survive under brutal conditions. Paraguayan soldiers had grown up with heat and thirst. And they knew how to fight like ghosts in the jungle. Yet there was one mistake both sides shared. They both underestimated Gran Chaco. Not the enemy army, but the land itself was the most terrifying adversary. The heat-exhausted soldiers after only hours of marching. Water became more valuable than ammunition. Malaria, dysentery, and infections killed more men than bullets. Supply routes were almost non-existent. And in that hell, the human spirit was eroded day by day. In 1933, the war entered its decisive phase with the Battle of Campo Vía. A large Bolivian force, believing it was advancing deep into enemy territory, was suddenly completely surrounded by Paraguayan troops. No water. No supplies. No route of retreat. Bolivian soldiers were trapped in the desert, where death came slowly and cruelly. Thousands collapsed from thirst. Others were struck down by disease. And finally, in desperation, entire units were forced to surrender. In a single campaign, Bolivia lost a large portion of its main fighting force. It was the turning point of the entire war. From weakness, Paraguay became the side with the initiative. From defense, they shifted to offense. But that victory brought no true joy. Because every step forward was paid for with the blood and lives of young men. In 1935, after 3 years of fighting, both nations were exhausted. The economy collapsed. Society fractured. A generation of men returned home with wounds that would never heal, both on their bodies and in their minds. Paraguay gained most of the Gran Chaco territory. Bolivia accepted defeat and lost the land in which it had placed so much hope. But the bitterest truth was this: neither side found the oil they had dreamed of. The war for oil ended without oil. The Chaco War left behind a heavy historical lesson. It showed how vague information, when combined with national pride and fear of loss, can push an entire country into catastrophe. It reminds us that wars do not always break out over resources that truly exist. Sometimes they erupt simply from illusions about what people fear they might lose in the future. Today, Gran Chaco remains as barren as ever. No oil. No prosperity. Only faint traces of trenches, nameless cemeteries. And the memory of a war that never needed to happen. A war that history must not be allowed to forget.